time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, Tom Carpenter. Tom Carpenter is Executive Director of the Hanford Challenge. Prior to his current position, Tom worked as the Director of the Nuclear Oversight Campaign for the Government Accountability Project from 1985 to 2007. He also founded the Cincinnati Alliance for Responsible Energy, which challenged plans to open the defect-ridden Zimmer nuclear power plant. And he also helped establish and is a board member of the Hanford Concerns Council and its predecessor, the Hanford Joint Council. And he's here to talk about the continuing unfolding situation at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation located in eastern Washington. So start out, tell us a little bit about what is the Hanford Challenge.
Yeah, Hanford Challenge is an oversight, some would say watchdog organization that monitors the cleanup at the Hanford nuclear site, tries to protect the public from radiation emergencies that might occur there, which seem to happen on a frequent basis. And we work with a lot of workers at the site, brave employees who raise serious safety concerns and protect them if they get in trouble. For instance, if they get fired from their jobs or whatever. So we have a legal director, staff attorney, and we're a small organization, but we have pretty big networks from many, many decades of working on this issue.
Small but feisty.
Right. Very feisty.
And good thing, too, as just recent as a couple weeks ago, there was another incident at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Could you talk about that?
Sure. And let's start with saying that the Hanford site, Hanford nuclear site, started in World War II to make plutonium for nuclear weapons. The very first reactors were built there. They were experimental in nature, and the reactors irradiated uranium, and the uranium was then made plutonium, when you bombard in a reactor. So then that plutonium was used in the first nuclear bomb using plutonium in Nagasaki, and was such a success for the American military that they went to plutonium production. Therefore, Hanford ramped up here in the state of Washington, southeastern Washington, and ran for about 45 years with 9 reactors and 5 big reprocessing facilities, and made the most contaminated facility in the nation and really the Western Hemisphere. So it's closed now. It's not making plutonium because we have so much of it, but it did leave this gigantic, horrendous mess. It's 2/3 of the nation's high-level nuclear waste. There's an ocean of contamination in the groundwater, and it remains a threat 25, 30 years after the operation ceased, and will for the foreseeable future because of just the vast amounts of contamination, radioactive and chemical, that are there. So Hanford is in transition. They are starting to tear down buildings and facilities, and one of those is called the Plutonium Finishing Plant. And a few weeks ago, in the process of tearing down one of the sub-facilities called the Plutonium Reclamation Facility, they clearly were not careful, and clouds of plutonium particles billowed out from the deconstruction, from knocking it down, and those particles went into the clean areas around. They have zones where they said, okay, contamination won't cross this fence, right? Maybe 100 yards away or 200 yards away, when in fact they started finding the contamination on workers' clothing, as well as on what do they call cookie sheets, which they really are cookie sheets. Little particles are detected on these things, and they realized that they had breached their containment. That was on a Friday in early December. They didn't do anything. Saturday, same thing. Sunday, they found more contamination. And it just went on through the next Wednesday, when finally, after 6 days of finding contamination in the clean area, a worker stopped work. The company says it stopped work. The union says it stopped work. But whatever, it stopped on Wednesday. No word to the public, no news release. And they just kind of quietly went about trying to figure out what was going on. And even other workers around the site weren't informed of what was happening. On Thursday, we got wind of it. Hanford Challenge has a great network of people, and someone contacted us and said, "Did you know what's happening out there?" And I had no idea, and neither did anybody else on the outside. So we tweeted it out. You know, we have a Twitter account, Hanford Challenge, and put that news out there. And started calling around to see if other people had heard about it, including in the news media. And Susanna Frames King 5 jumped on it real hard. She has her own networks too. And, you know, all day Thursday consisted of Hanford Challenge and King 5 kind of battering Hanford with tweets and questions and trying to get them to respond. And I did call the site, and they confirmed this was happening. But they were not forthcoming with any real information other than saying, yeah, there was a release, but it was radon, right? It was not radon, it was plutonium particles. But that's what they told the local paper, which ran that story, that it was radon, and that they didn't actually find contamination on workers' clothing when we had internal documents saying that it was their documents. And so Thursday night, they quietly lifted the stop work. And despite not knowing the cause, despite not having it under control, and on Friday, they had another release. And once again, they did not announce it. They kept working through Sunday. And I think the Saturday was off, but on Sunday, they realized that there was another serious release, and this time they found contamination on vehicles and in the parking lot, including workers' personal vehicles and company vehicles, Hanford government vehicles, et cetera, some of which had left the site and gone into town with contamination on them. This is a big no-no. You don't do this at a plutonium factory. You control your plutonium. And plutonium, I might say, is a very deadly particle. It doesn't really exist in nature. It only happens because man or humankind split the atom. The plutonium is useful for nuclear bombs, but it also has a tremendously bad health effect in microscopic quantities. So I was amused then to read when Hanford finally did start putting stuff out there, that these were specks of plutonium and microscopic quantities of plutonium. It's like, well, how much do you think you need to inhale into your lung? I mean, the amounts, you can't see what would be a fatal dose, right? And so this is now covering, first they said it was a couple of vehicles, and then it was like 7. Then it went to 13, and then 19, and now it's 21 vehicles. And how many workers, we don't know, have inhaled it. And so this is a growing crisis. And if it's on the vehicles, on these 21 vehicles, certainly it's contaminated people, it's contaminated clothing. People have probably taken this stuff home. And I know that Hanford has sent teams of radiation technicians to workers' houses to check their houses. And we're far from over on this incident, by the way. It's ongoing, and they still don't know how far it's gone.
So they know that at least a minimum of 7 worker personal vehicles traveled off of Hanford, potentially going home, maybe stopping at the store, maybe going to a restaurant, right. Taking your coat off when you get in the restaurant, hanging up next to other people's coats. I mean, it seems like there's numerous ways where particles that had been on their clothing and or them could be distributed elsewhere.
Right. And also, this stuff lasts forever. So plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, and it takes 10 half-lives for it to be considered gone. So essentially, plutonium is around for 250,000 years. So introducing it into the community, even in tiny quantities, is a bad idea. It doesn't go away. you can't destroy it. It is there. You can barely detect it. So we don't know how much contamination was on these vehicles when they left for town. We just know it was still on there when some of it was still detected when they came back to the site. What about vehicles that left the site and didn't come back, right? So there's a lot of questions to be answered here. And one thing I want to point out is they shouldn't have been surprised. They had plutonium releases from this same facility in the same operation back in January and February of 2017. They lost control. There was plutonium beyond the fence line then. And then they had another release in April. And then in May, they had a very serious one. Workers found plutonium specks on their clothing and contamination on cars then as well. They weren't really planning to test the workers for inhalation. So I asked the Department of Energy if they were going to do that, and they kind of stuttered around and finally said, yes, we're going to make that available to workers. So it's like, you don't have to take these tests, and they examine fecal matter, right? So it's not very pleasant, but that's how they do it. So they sent workers home with kits, and it ended up, I think, 300 or 280 workers took these kits home and returned samples, and of that, 31 came back with plutonium in their systems. So they inhaled or ingested plutonium, which is not a good day. Hanford hastened to say, "Oh, that's just a little bit of radiation, and it's like flying on an airplane." No, it's not. These were manufactured hot plutonium particles that have a tremendous health impact over time. And it keeps irradiating. If it's in your tissues, if it's in your lung, most of it stays in your lung the rest of your life. And for anyone to say they know what the risk is, you can't, because the health effects of plutonium there's still a huge scientific debate about that. So they poisoned workers. Back in June, they weren't even going to test initially, it looks like. They didn't have the kits available for weeks. So many workers didn't even get tested for 2 weeks or even a month later because they weren't ready, at a plutonium plant for, these kind of exposures to happen. So that happened in June. You think they would have learned a lesson. And what is the lesson? Well, contain the plutonium, put tinting up around to stop the particles from flowing out. You see these giant tents here in Seattle around office buildings that are being built or torn down, 40-story buildings. And at Hanford, we're talking 2 or 3 stories, maybe 4 or 5, but they weren't willing to spend the money and to take the time necessary to protect their workforce. Why? Because they were in a hurry to get it done. And the contractor, of course, had fee. It had to make its money. And so the workers, took it in the teeth, basically. I mean, figuratively as well as literally in this case.
So with the June incident, of the people tested, over 10% were found to have
that's correct.
Consumed plutonium.
Yep. And, they're worried people at this point. Workers feel like they've been misled. This latest incident, they ordered people to stay inside their work areas, not leave, but they weren't calling it a take cover event. Why? Because that's bad publicity, right? So you don't have a take cover event. They didn't declare any kind of site emergency. They were trying to keep the drama out of it and say, oh, everything's fine. Yet they had emergency vehicles at all the entrances and exits to this area, controlling access. And there are workers next door at the tank farms watching what the heck's going on over there. And we were getting phone calls saying, do you know what's happening over at PRF? Yes, they've had a plutonium release. What? Oh, they were furious. And some companies, directed its employees to not access that area. So, Mission Support Alliance, MSA, sent out a bulletin to its employees saying, there's something going on over there. don't access the plutonium reclamation facility. But the Hanford itself, management was not declaring any kind of site emergency or take cover or anything else, and still have not, even as more and more vehicles are contaminated. They have stopped work at the facility, and both our senators have written letters, Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray, saying, we hope you're not planning to stop work. We hope you get to the bottom of this. Worker safety has to come first. But with no mention of the fact that, this has been going on actually for over a year now at the Hanford site. And
not to mention that last time you were on, we talked about it, but the workers who are over at working on the tank farms are dealing with their own issues with toxic
chemical vapors,
yep. and numerous people there have been sent to the hospital and have serious issues as well, just from chemicals at the tank farm. As of the latest report that came out from Department of Energy, they're estimating 91 total PFP-controlled government vehicles were potentially exposed, and they've tested 46 of those so far. So it sounds like they're only halfway through on the initial count of the number of vehicles impacted.
Yes, and they care a lot about the vehicles because they are medium, for contamination spread. But I'm wondering about the people out there and how good a job they're actually doing monitoring for radioactivity on people or something they might have inhaled. This is the kind of incident that 20 years ago at Hanford would have caused a site shutdown for months because clearly the safety margin is gone. The nuclear safety culture is all but disappeared. It used to be there to a degree at the Hanford site, especially when it came to workers' health and safety. But it's just been, the cleanup is such a commodity now. It's so much money involved for these contractors. They want it. The government's anxious to get the job done, and so is the state. So they take shortcuts and unnecessary risks as opposed to doing it right, going slow. And they've wasted literally tens of billions of dollars at the Hanford site in pursuit, deciding to do a cleanup in this fashion.
A question here. So again, I have in my hands several of the DOE update reports that are 2-pagers that they send out. On the December 22nd report, they're talking about the survey. The survey is when they go out and sample for contamination. And release of no contamination discovered of 63 government vehicles on December 21st allowed CHPRC to lift its stop work on the use of government vehicles driven in the vicinity of the PFP between December 15th and December 18th. So I'm wondering why they aren't going back to December 8th when the first contamination was noted. Any insights into why they're not expanding the number of vehicles?
I mean, they're trying to contract it down so they can finish the job and say it's over. And again, they are not acting conservatively. They're not acting in a manner that is protective of the workers out there. And I keep waiting for the Department of Energy, which is the agency that owns the site and is supposed to be regulating them, will start doing their job and tell the contractor, you're done, out of the way. We're going to investigate this and find out what happened and how bad it is and bring in some outside experts because clearly this company can't get this job done. It's totally failed to protect these workers. And now the community has contamination in it downtown because of these vehicles. We don't know how much, we don't know where. It's not time to hit the panic button, but I wouldn't be very happy if I lived in those communities of Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, not knowing where these vehicles went, if people had plutonium on their clothes. By the way, also a year and a half ago, plutonium contamination on these coolers were sent into town, and contamination left the site then as well. Same facility, Plutonium Finishing Plant. And it caused quite a bit of consternation to the point where the president who was Obama at the time, had to activate the nuclear emergency security team to go and track down these coolers, which had been sent across the United States by truck, track them down in Ohio and Pennsylvania to assure that plutonium contamination wasn't being strewn about and that people were unknowingly being subjected to this. So that was pretty quiet. It happened at the time, but they just have this nasty little habit. This contractor in particular, the CH2, of letting this stuff get out and shrugging their shoulders like it's no big deal, and it is a big deal.
Also, in these reports, it mentions that there were air samples taken. And again, you would know this from experience, but it's interesting to watch how these reports morph over time. They talk about air samples taken on the 19th and the 20th on the December 26th notice. But on the December 20th notice, it's a little more specific. Washington State Department of Health took one air sample on December 19th and a second air sample on December 20th. Results not anticipated until February 2018. Wow. So just one sample on a given day in a given location. What exactly is the Department of Health's role here for those of us who live in Washington State?
Well, it's a bureau of the state of Washington, and it is supposed to monitor the air for radiation releases from Hanford and other places. And they're kind of a joke. They found contamination from the June incident on an air monitor next to the highway, and contaminated with plutonium and americium. And it took them 2 months to get that news out, right? So we found out about it way after the fact. And part of that is it takes a while to get those things counted, right? These particles are very small. You have to send it to a lab. It has to be licensed and certified. So you have to cut them a break on that. But they were quite dismissive of it. And, that's kind of the attitude. I had I heard about, one of these plutonium contamination events off-site. There was another one at Bonita Bridge, and before that, I mentioned these coolers, and I had some interaction with the Department of Health, and I called up one of their officers, and I knew that plutonium had left the site on these coolers, and I said, "So how's it going?" "Oh, it's all normal. It's fine." I said, "Really? Because I heard that there's plutonium contamination on coolers that left the site." Oh. Yeah, that. I mean, and he just continued to fish to see how much I knew before fessing up to anything. And I said, "Really? Because, didn't leave the site, and then, they found it in his van and on the coolers, and didn't those coolers then leave for Ohio and Pennsylvania?" "Oh, yeah, I think so. I think that happened." "Really? And didn't they call the National Emergency Nuclear Response Team?" He goes, "Yeah, I think, I'm not sure, but I've heard that." And it's like, well, where's the public announcement on any of this, right? And were they going to say anything to anybody? So I don't get it, but it seems to be a pro-Hanford, buddy-buddy relationship, as opposed to a, I guess there's a term for it, which is, captured regulatory, a captured regulator. And I would like to see them be more aggressive, be more independent, and actually feel like they're protecting us in these situations. But as it is, we are preparing to put up air monitors around Richland and the Tri-Cities.
You being Hanford Challenge.
Hanford Challenge, along with SafeCast, which is a nonprofit organization that created these real-time counting instruments that measures gamma and beta. And we're going to set these things up so they're continuous air monitors, just because we need to have some independent checking going on. We'd love to put up dozens and dozens of these things. We're going to start with 3. They're expensive, right? They're $500 a pop, so we can do 3 right now. SafeCast is loaning us these instruments, so good on them. They're very active around Fukushima, but they're taking a strong interest in the Hanford site as well.
As it should. Department of Health also appears to be the oversight group when the DOE folks were doing the testing of individuals' houses that were potentially contaminated.
Right.
So it doesn't seem overly inspiring there that you have the most aggressive Washington State entity with those people doing the assessment.
Well, you know, some of the people that work there are fine. I think just as a bureaucracy, they're really into assuring the public that things are okay, no matter what. So that's, you know, that disturbs me, is that, you know, the Purex tunnel collapsed. Oh, everything's fine, right? There was nothing happens at Hanford that alarms them. And I understand you don't want to panic the public unnecessarily, and you want some truth, right? You want some credibility. So I'd love to see that, you know, ethic get developed within the Department of Health, and that we could actually rely upon them to, you know, do the right thing, be good at their jobs, you know, be transparent. And I don't really get the feeling that that's happening. You know, there have been other incidents at the, you know, other facilities around the Hanford site where Department of Health, in my view, has fallen down on the job. Permafix, you know, had a plutonium contamination incident, and it's like, yeah, just clean it up and move on. No, what happened? You know, stop. But Hanford's a contaminated place. It's pretty worrisome. So, and there's, you know, Trump administration has moved in, and you know they're proposing shortcuts and cutbacks. So, you know, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Rick Perry's in charge of DOE currently, isn't he?
Yeah, Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, he of Dancing with the Stars fame, you know, and the whole administration is trying to save money to pay for their big tax cuts for billionaires, and they're looking at the Hanford site with a very jaded eye, saying, "Well, this is expensive. Why don't we just put concrete in the tanks and walk away?" As opposed to actually remove the waste from these tanks. This is the worst stuff in the world, right? You really can't put concrete in the tanks and walk away. You'd be turning the site into a high-level nuclear waste repository that has no license, no monitoring, and is unqualified to be that. So we've got quite a fight on our hands into the future.
All right. And the other Washington State entity that regularly appears, at least from news reports involved, is the Department of Ecology. They seem as robust as Department of Health.
They're a little better, right? Okay. So they've gotten better under the leadership of someone named Alex Smith, and she is a RCRA attorney. RCRA is the hazardous waste law. So we have hopes that things are improving over there.
Very good. We're just about out of time talking with Tom Carpenter, Executive Director of Hanford Challenge. And obviously, this is a lot for anyone listening to consume in a short 29 minutes. How can people connect to Hanford Challenge and find out more?
Well, you can look us up on our Facebook, Hanford Challenge, as well as we have a Twitter account, as I mentioned. You know, we're in the end of the year. We're doing a big fundraising drive. So give to KEXP and give to Hanford Challenge. You know, your gift is doubled if you give by the end of the year. We have a very generous board member who's doubling our gifts up to $20,000.
Very good. And potentially some of that could go towards some more monitors over there at Hanford.
Yep, more monitors and just our existence really is we have to pay the bills like everybody else.
Gas fees for driving from here to there.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, with that, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again.
Great to be here.